watching a video, but I'm having a reaction to it
If you
myself.
bought a pickup truck in 2024, it is likely already broken. If you bought an RV, it is likely already leaking. And if you bought a new washing machine, you are probably already shopping for its replacement.
We bought one very recently, but it was probably not this year exactly, or last year exactly,
We
but the year
expose the
before.
piece rate labor destroying the RV industry. We expose the EPA mandates destroying diesel engines. But the comments section kept telling us the same story. It isn't just trucks, it's everything. You are right. There is a pattern here. Whether it is a $100,000 truck or a $500 dishwasher, the engineering philosophy is identical. We have uncovered a systemic shift in manufacturing that has effectively placed a death clock on every single asset you own. To understand why your tools and appliances are failing, you have to look at the label on the back. For 50 years, the phrase "Made in USA" was the gold standard. It meant that Americans.
Not really, to be honest with you, about that one. A lot of our high quality stuff came from countries like Japan and Germany, even back then in that era. But you know, but one of the things that I found out about the Made in America bullshit is that with so many people in prison, there's an enormous amount of prison labor that happens in this country at this point, and some of it's in manufacturing. Quite a bit of it is in manufacturing, and if you gain the skills there in prison to do that sort of thing, you come out the other. You come out the other side, and you end up realizing that they get to stamp a "Made in America" sticker on something if they use prison labor, and that there's an exception written into the 13th Amendment that says, except as punishment for a crime. So slavery is legal as punishment for a crime. So we still live, in a world where slavery hasn't truly been abolished. It's just been redistributed onto criminals.
Steel was cast in American foundries. Machine.
And also, there was an incentive in order to create a huge amount of prisoners to outlaw far more than needed to be. This is part of the dysfunctional culture of how America works and everything, and the pressure that's been put on things. You have corporatized prisons and everything else, and gross incentives to pass laws that criminalize a lot of activities that people engage in, like certain drugs are associated with certain groups, and so they outlaw that drug, and then they mostly enforce against people of a certain skin color, not white people. Just saying, we sometimes I feel very lucky in a lot of ways that I am a white guy because I don't have to deal with all that shit, and everything. I realize and recognize that I've got privilege. I mean, when the cops come and, they punish people for using drugs, do they target white communities that abuse drugs just as frequently as black ones? No, they almost always frequent the black community. I mean, if I were to travel around and transport drugs, my likelihood of being pulled over for it is astronomically smaller than it is if somebody is black doing the same thing. Driving while black is seen as a thing in the black community. It's a whole phrase and everything. But for why the cops pulled you over, I mean, racialized profiling is unfortunately legal, and they engage in a lot of it.
By American engineers and assembled by American workers. Today, that phrase has been.
And my laughter on that one is gallows humor, and it's not that I don't find it tragic or anything. It's just my way of coping with the reality of American racism. It's terrible. I have to freely admit and to say that and everything, and that I feel somewhat guilty that, there's that private amount of grim amusement going on for me about it. It's not at all funny in reality, but, I can't help it. Like, there's just nothing. There's just sort of a dark, grim humor to all of it, and I can't really help the gallows humor of it all. It happens in an almost involuntary fashion. In reality, I'm horrified by all of it. It's just, there's something funny about all the terrible shit that's happening,
And replaced by illegal loophole. Look closely at your new power tools. Look at your new generator. The label likely says, assembled in the USA with global material.
I have to say, America hasn't been the greatest at manufacturing shit for a long time. It's you know, even if it does say made in the USA, it's not made in the USA by actual Americans. It's made in the USA by machines.
This is not a badge of honor. It is a confession. It means the company bought the cheapest plastic motors and gears from a factory in Shenzhen, China, shipped them in a container to a warehouse in Ohio, and paid a worker minimum wage to put them in a box. The soul of the machine is foreign junk. Only the cardboard box is American. This allows corporations to charge you a premium price for a domestic product while paying rock-bottom prices for imported garbage. You are paying for the legacy of the brand name, but you are buying the reality of the lowest bidder. This is where the engineering turns malicious. In the past, engineers were told to build a machine that would last as long, but you are buying the reality of the lowest bidder. This is where the engineering turns malicious. In the past, engineers were told to build a machine that would last as long as possible. Today, they are told to build a machine that lasts exactly 1 day longer than the warranty. This is achieved through a process called value engineering. They take a robust machine, like a transmission or a washing machine motor, and they analyze every single part. If a metal gear costs $4 and lasts for 20 years, they replace it with a plastic gear that costs 40 cents and lasts for 5 years.
You know what I thought when I saw that and everything, and saw the $4 metal and everything, I realized the same thing happens with molded plugs, which I'm going to have to replace the cable on here with a much better one with this lamp and everything. But that's a reality that goes on and everything. Molded cabling, it's not used ultimately to make the product fail faster. That's a conspiracy theory. It's used because it's cheaper. Ultimately, when you sell millions and millions of units, to give them a cheap 40-cent plastic part over a $4 one, because $4 multiplied over, in the manufacturing process, when you sell individual units to millions of people at scale, it starts to add up. That $3.60 starts to add up incredibly quickly on the balance sheets. This is not done with malicious intention on behalf of the companies. Honestly, it's done as a cost-saving measure, and it ends up biting us in the ass in the end, because molded cabling fails a lot easier and wiggles until something bends out of position and snaps, and products don't last as long as they used to as a consequence of these kinds of decisions where of an electronics part, the fucking plug is one of the most likely places to actually break on the thing.
It with a plastic gear that costs 40 cents and lasts for 5 years. They call this optimization. We call it the kill switch. We see this in modern trucks, where they use plastic oil pans that warp and leak. We see this in RVs, where they use plastic plumbing fittings that crack in the cold.
I saw that, and the one thing that I thought when I saw that was, you can stick it to the man on these things, and doing it is just getting easier and easier to do as the years wane on. There's tutorials on how to replace the cable ends and everything of a cable and put a new plug on something, and it's not particularly difficult to gain those skills, to be honest with you, especially with all the tutorials that are, available on YouTube. But of this in particular, of things like, for example, the plastic parts for, the plumbing system on an RV, and the plastic parts for the gears within something, when a metal one would have held up a lot better. 3D printing metal has become a thing. And also, if you're like me, you don't have the skills to go into an editor and make, to make the parts or anything. And I don't know. I mean, I should investigate, going to one of the sites and see if they make it easy, for you and everything. They might, have a tool set that I could learn to actually do it. But see, the thing is that, you submit your design files and some, to a forge that does this sort of thing, and with a 3D printing forge basically, and they'll go and create, they're gonna have to have a metal one, but you create one that is in the exact shape and position and everything, where all the little nozzles and parts would fit just right, and you can have that 3D printed by somebody, and if they make it difficult, well, you could go on Fiverr and bribe somebody, to make the design files for you, and then go and have the part 3D printed. And not only that, well, if you do have the design files at that point, you can go out and likely submit your design at that point, to, never mind, anyways, but the patent office. But yeah, you could potentially sell these parts to people through the eBay ecosystem and say, hey, this solves this particular problem. You can take the plastic part out and put a better one in, and this non-OEM upgrade would make the system last a lot longer than the OEM parts, which are a cheap plastic piece of shit. Like, these are this is a problem that it's true, it happens, but it's a problem that we, as at the end of the supply chain, as the end consumers, can attack and solve. It's not something that is a fundamentally unsolvable problem for the end consumer. It is something that can be addressed by us.
And we see it in your home appliances. The drum of your washing machine might be stainless steel. The motor might be powerful. But the connection point between them is a 10-cent plastic clip. When that clip snaps, the entire machine is totaled. They do not sell the clip. They only sell the entire drum assembly, which
doesn't matter. Like I said, we live in an era of being able to 3D print stuff. They won't sell it to you. Fine, fuck them. 3D print it. Resist. Don't go out and buy the whole fucking drum assembly. Give them the middle fucking finger, and have it 3D printed out of metal and have multiple clips. You can fuck these people over. You can take their whole plan and agenda and sabotage it these days. You don't have to accept this stuff. You don't have to sit here and just take the abuse. You can fight back. You can resist.
Costs more than a new washer. This is not an accident. This is a design feature. They have engineered a single point of failure that forces you to throw away a 99% perfect machine.
I used to agree with this person. I used to think that they were right. I used to think that this was, especially because I became aware of planned obsolescence, I used to kind of conspiratize about this sort of thing. I used to see it that way. But when I thought really deep and hard about it, I realized that this likely wasn't. That it was far more likely that the simpler explanation was the case, which is just, it's cheaper at massive scale to use cheap parts than it is to use expensive ones, or ones that are even just $3.60 more expensive. But when you're selling the same truck to millions of different consumers, like what, let's assume for the sake of the math that you sell three, like, let's say that ends up being 3 million units of the car on and everything, and this is just within this country alone. At that point, you're already talking about a $10,800,000 savings multiplied across the 300 million people that you sold the whole thing to. So a small $3.60 can be no big deal for the end consumer. And in fact, the small bill that it would take to go to Fiverr and get somebody to make the design files for you and everything, it's a lot cheaper, and everything, to go and just have one 3D printed for yourself than to replace either the whole drum assembly, and everything, and you know, to have it made out of metal and everything, and you know, all these all these design decisions that are shitty. It's like molded cabling, you know. It saves them a bunch of money to use it, but that doesn't stop you from going in and, you know, peeling back the outer layer of the end of a cable with, you know, some wire strippers, and then, you know, gently, you know, the way that you use a wire stripper isn't, you know, that you don't fully, you know, sink it into the metal. You gently nick the metal, you know, the whole thing, so that it starts to weaken a little bit, and there's a gash in it, but it doesn't go all the way through, and then you start bending back and forth, and then once it finally snaps and it's fully severed, you pull it off. That's how to do it and everything. But yeah, that's something I learned from experience, you know, about wire stripping and everything, to reveal the copper and everything, and from watching people do it and everything, and to expose it. But this, like, I've got a good wire stripper now and everything, so I can do jobs like that and get that sort of thing done and everything, and you know, especially because the plug on a damn electronic device is the most likely place for it to break, you know. It happens all the time with molded cabling, but this wasn't a conspiracy. This happened because it cut cost for the company to do it, to make it out of cheap shit. You cheap, shitty molded plastic cables and everything. Now, I will say, you know, ask experts, or at least chat GPT, about things like if it's wise to replace a molded cabling for a laptop, because you will get a good answer that because of it various parts that are in the laptop, no, don't do this.
Because of a 1% defect. Who is responsible for this? It is rarely the engineers. It is almost always the owners. Most of the legendary American brands you grew up with do not exist anymore. They have been bought, gutted, and worn like a skin suit by private equity firms. Take a brand like Craftsman Tools. For decades, Sears sold Craftsman wrenches that were forged in the United States and guaranteed forever. But when the brand was sold, the new owners shut down the American factories. They moved production to China and Taiwan. They kept the red logo, they kept the name, but they...
Another thing that I wanted to say about this person seems like their understanding of what the quality of Chinese products are quality-wise remains mired in, you know, 20 years ago. The fact of the matter is that China has gotten a lot better at producing quality stuff. You know, the quality across their supply chain has improved massively. Chinese products aren't as unreliable as they once were.
Hollowed out the steel. Now when you buy that wrench, it is made of softer metal. It rounds off bolts. It breaks under torque. But the price did not go down. The private equity model is simple. Buy a brand with a high reputation for quality. Fire the expensive engineers and quality control staff. Switch to cheaper materials and foreign labor. Ride the reputation of the brand for 10 years, selling junk to loyal customers who do not know better. By the time the public realizes the quality is gone, the investors have already made their billions and moved on to the next victim. They are strip mining the trust that took a century to build. So if the product is designed
very true,
to
private
break,
equity has caused a lot of problems. But again, like I said, it's not as if these types of problems, you know, cannot be resisted and fought back against. And even if it isn't malicious, and even if I'm right and this person is wrong, and there isn't a genuine conspiracy going on here, it's just that manufacturing at scale, when you sell to millions of people, makes savings $3.60 actually matter. You know, because it ends up, you know, over 3 million units already adding up to $10 million and almost $11 million basically over the course of that, you know, experience and everything. And so, you know, a small number multiplied by a very large number is also a large number. You know, grim, dark humor to all this again. So, I mean, my laughter on this, is also just because, of course, I mean, it's a little bit strange to me that people don't understand this, especially especially when I start seeing it in mathematicians and IT engineers and everything that don't get it. I mean, it was almost funny to me. I mean, one of the ways in which it becomes a sort of gallows humor for me to look at what happens in the world of IT and everything, and what happens in software development, and my sense of horror at it is that when I see things happen, right, I see something that's there where it's like a process will slow things down, and it will be reporting results about how long it took to get from start to finish to be about 450 milliseconds. But I'm sitting there and I'm realizing that same process is something that computers could use that time to get a ton of work done if they were directed to within, they could do just an absolute enormous amount in that time. But this one process is slowing the whole damn thing down by this much. And, it doesn't seem like a big deal because you can barely perceive 450 milliseconds of time. It's true. It seems to go by in an instant for somebody like us, but from the human perspective. But think about this. Think about the way that self same process is now going to be repeated by the computer. And the task that it's doing in real time is going to be done. Every day for at least 16 hours of every day while people are at work or awake. And accessing things, and maybe even 24/7 if sites are accessed by users in the overnight periods, because that stuff is going to be important then too in managing those sessions and everything. Even if it is the crack of dawn and everything and nobody's actually in the office, the computer's going to be repeating this process over and over and over again. Now, it doesn't take very many actual processes, it's just and runs for that 400 milliseconds to add up like to an absolutely staggering amount of time, in a very short window of time. And the processing time that gets wasted on these slow executing processes sure adds up fucking quickly. And it's something that a lot of people that do engineering and don't should understand properly. They should know this. They should realize it took a lot of math skills to get to the point where you're at. Why don't you get this? Take a very small percentage of a very large number, and you're going to end up with another large number. That's just the reality. I mean, it's how I predicted COVID-19 was going to be a huge deal, because everybody else saw that 3%, fatality rate and sat there like, no, that's not going to be. This is no big deal. Most of us are not going to be affected by this. We're not going to die. We're in too good of health to be challenged by this. And it's like, you're right about that for most of you. But, the fact of the matter is, something that has a 3% odds of killing you and everything, when that infection starts to get spread out by over hundreds of millions of people, I mean, it's not, I mean, just to show you the math on the Windows calculator, you're at 1 million, and you're at 100 million infections, at that point you're already at 3,300,000 333,300 100,000,000 so times 0.03. At that point, you're already talking about just an, oh, wait a minute, no, wait, that's right, that's 3%. So anyways, that's I mean, that's over, that's basically rounded to 3 million, or in practice 3.333333333 million, and everything people, a very small percentage of 100 million infections, and suddenly you're burying millions of people on the ground at that point. And the morgues get completely overwhelmed and full of people. The hospital rooms start to run out of they start to be just absolutely slammed with people that need help and everything. And the morgues start to fill up and everything, and it takes time to process all the corpses, and this just this starts to become a massive imposition for society and to become a very big deal very fucking quickly. It doesn't you don't need that many infections for an outbreak, that goes, and spreads very, very wide and far and at a high mortality rate to get millions of deaths. That's just the fundamental reality of the math and everything. It's brutal, and it's the same thing. The same thing applies to computers. You add a couple of milliseconds of processing time. It might not seem like a big deal until you realize that self-same process may run in the background every day, hundreds of millions of times every single day. At that point, at that scale, it adds up and multiplies incredibly quickly, and everything. And suddenly you're talking about a whole days and years and years and years of time just completely wasted in computing that could be spent on something else and doing something in a far more efficient process. It doesn't take much waste on a computer and everything for a process that is running, over and over again to end up, having enormous consequences and everything. And I don't get it. Most people who work in IT had advanced degrees and had to go through a lot of math training and everything, and yet this concept seems to escape them because they're always minimizing performance